Friends, will you pray with me? And as you feel so comfortable, I invite you to join in on the second time through. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God. Amen. Full disclosure, I preached a version of this sermon just about a month ago in Washington, but even as I was preaching it, I was thinking, I need to say this in Hancock. And then somebody else watched that sermon and they said to me, hey, you need to preach this in Hancock. So the Spirit has said, preach it again. So a version, it's been slightly edited, but just know that I've done this before. So a recent study came out that said that by 2070, so just under 50 years from now, Christians will be a minority in the United States. Now, this perhaps comes as no surprise to those of us who have been sort of watching church trends over the last decade or a few decades. But what's interesting to me is that people are not leaving for other religions. The prediction is not that, we're going to have an influx of immigrants from other faith traditions or that people are all going to convert to something else. But instead, people are becoming religiously unaffiliated. So sometimes that looks like people who say I'm spiritual but not religious, or they just, believe in something but nothing specific. They're not part of a faith community, specifically not a Christian community, and they're not identifying as Christians even if they grew up in a Christian tradition and their families of origin are Christians. Now, 2070, most of us in this room will not be here. It's pushing it even for me. But that knowledge and that trajectory, projected trajectory, gives us an opportunity right now for some self-reflection. And I'm using self as sort of a body, as the body of Christ, not as individuals. To look closely at the church. To ask, why? Why are so many Americans leaving Christianity? Now, one theory that was put in the article I read about this study said that as society progresses, as we become more industrialized, as we outsource sort of the social supports, healthcare, help for the poor and the hungry, all those things that used to be sort of the domain of the church, that we naturally become more secular. So it's just sort of a given. That's one theory. Now, others suggest that we might want to take a look inward and see how we might, as the church ourselves, have been a part of this exodus from faith. This passage we heard from Jeremiah, who is, I'll remind you, is the weeping prophet, partly because of this particular passage, partly because of some of the passages that we've heard in the last couple weeks. I love, you don't get to see it, I don't know if you could hear it though, there's a parenthetical interjection in that passage. So, Jeremiah is lamenting, is the Lord not in Zion? Is her king not in her? And then there's these parentheses where God interjects and says, why have they provoked me to anger with their foreign idols? Like, all right, hold on. You want to cry and lament. Let's have a talk and have a conversation here about what's really been going on. Jeremiah is asking questions on behalf of the people. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no soothing of our grief? Now, if we look around this congregation this morning, the majority of us are of one particular generation, maybe two. Maybe we're spread out across 2 generations. But I am an obvious outlier. Now, this is not particular to Hancock by any means. It is probably more frequent in the Northeast than many other parts of the U.S. The Northeast has been shown to be on a faster trajectory towards becoming more secular and older, or aging. Now, maybe that'll shift as all these people have been moving up to New Hampshire through the pandemic and buying up all these houses and everything. Maybe all these younger people are coming, deciding they want something different. We'll see. But this is what we're seeing in many churches. So often, the church's response to that situation is, we need families with young kids. We need youth in the church again. We need this because otherwise the church will die when we're gone. Rarely do I hear people ask, why? Why are younger people, because I'm not even that young anymore, I just got my first pair of progressive lenses this week, so I can't even be in that young section, we'll say younger people, not in church. Why is it that even though our parents brought us to church faithfully, we grew up going to Sunday school and singing in children's choirs, and some of us even stuck around after confirmation to do youth group, but why didn't we stick around after that? We got to adulthood and we disappeared. And unlike previous generations, who sure, always had a segment of sort of dispersing through college and early 20s, came back when they had their own children, to raise their children in the faith tradition in which they were raised. My generation, the ones after me, we haven't. Why? That's the question we need to answer. Not how can we get them in, but why did they leave? I just realized that I skipped a whole bunch because this printed on 2 pages, 2 slides. All right then, that's fine. All right.
It's the new glasses.
It is the new glasses. I'm going, wow, that's really short. Okay. All right. Okay. Now I see now I'm a little lost, but that's okay. This is what happens when I don't number my pages and when I don't usually have notes for my sermons. Okay. We'll figure it out. It'll be fun. Okay, so let's go back to the parenthetical interjection for a second. We often look around at our churches. We see these lost generations that are not here, and we weep and lament. Maybe not so overtly, but we sort of wring our hands and we have lots of meetings and conversations at coffee hour about what to do about this. And we sort of complain about soccer and other things. And maybe there are parenthetical interjections. What might they be? Well, maybe what might be the idols that we are focusing on that have turned us away from God? Well, maybe traditions, holding really tight to doing things a certain way. The liturgy, the activities that we've always done, the way we do education. Maybe language. If all our liturgy and our hymns are very masculine, maybe that's a little bit disconcerting in a world that doesn't do that as much anymore. Maybe we exclude people in our language and don't even realize it. And in that exclusion, maybe that's part of it too. The exclusion of certain groups of people from the life of faith. Now, some of that is the big, quote-unquote, controversial groups like the LGBTQ community or people with mental illness. That's part of it. But it's also smaller groups like single mothers, people who are divorced, situations that now barely cause any notice in our society, but historically have been overtly or not so much disregarded by the church or told people you can't be here. Perhaps, contrary to what some people might think, it is a hesitancy to speak up about social justice. Are there other idols in the church that have made people turn away? What things have we put on pedestals rather than focusing on God and how God is leading us? How have we missed opportunities to be a balm to someone's grief and pain rather than the cause of someone's grief and pain? Now, I'm not offering, sorry if you expected this, any quick and easy answers in this sermon this morning, but it gives us something to reflect on and pay attention to. So what about Christianity and about church doesn't meet the needs of, say, Generation X and below? What is so off-putting or just not important? Now, in addressing these questions, we have to be careful not to sort of fall into that consumer church mindset of marketing or catering to wants and trends and changing just to be attractive, or thinking that if we make it shiny and hip, people will just come. Not wanting to just change just to be liked. You know, like, how many of you are parents of middle school children? Don't change just to make everybody like you. It's something deeper. What would make the church relevant in people's lives today? In younger people's lives in particular, yes, but there's not a lot of young people in Hancock, let's be honest. And this sanctuary is still not full. So, where is everybody? What grief and hurt and questions do they, outside these walls, have that the church could potentially address and answer, but isn't? We're so focused on making sure we use the same version of the same prayer that we've used forever, or only sing hymns that everyone knows, or making sure that our buildings look nice and keep their picturesque historical appearance, or that worship maintains a certain tone or solemnity that excludes any interruption or noise or levity. Say children forget to whisper, or somebody needs to get up and move around, because let's be honest, these pews, not the most comfortable seats. You have back issues. Or heaven forbid, maybe we laugh and joke outside of announcement time. Or we focus on making sure we don't upset the people who have been here a long time, either by addressing topics that make them uncomfortable or by changing things too much from what is familiar. Here we go. No, that's the last page. All right, we'll go with this. The world is not the same. We have rapidly changed in the last 50 years, and that's the time period that is seeing the greatest decline in Christian identity and church membership. So you look at the charts, and you see, there's some ups and downs, whatever, and then all of a sudden, just goes. 50 years ago, that's 1972, which was not that long ago. Somehow that's 50 years. So, consider just before that. Let's back up even a little bit longer, just to get some good context, okay? What our country was like in the 50s. Just a moment. So we're post-war. We sort of have this focus on the nuclear family, mom, dad, 2 kids or more, have lots of kids. Women are back in the home after having worked during the war. It's a celebration of God and country. This is when one nation under God is added to the Pledge of Allegiance. There's this emphasis on uniformity and conformity. And just in case you hadn't realized, when people say they want to take America back, to the good old, that's where they want to go. 1950s US. Everybody was Christian. Everything was closed on Sundays. Everyone was part of some church. I say everybody because we know that there were some who weren't, but that was the assumption. And if you weren't, you were some kind of social outcast. Then come the 60s. We get the social justice movements. Young people are pushing back on that conformity. Some of you may remember this. The start of the Vietnam War and multiple assassinations of prominent leaders. Move into the 70s. So here's when the church decline begins. We have this continued trend of unrest. There's a push for equal rights of marginalized groups. The women's movement, we include the decision of Roe v. Wade, the continuation of and protests against the war in Vietnam. We have an energy crisis, the rise in crime. This is when we have in New York City, like the Bronx is burning situation. Nixon undermines people's faith in government and maybe institutions in general. And there's a push for conservatism that is the backlash to that sort of counterculture movement of the 60s. So then we have the 80s. We have the dominance of political conservatism. The AIDS crisis and the continued struggle for gay rights. Greed is good. You all remember that I was saying? Importing cheap stuff. So we have a rise in consumerism and materialism. We have Madonna, her material girl. That is high point 80s. And the world events include the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And there is starting to be a little bit more increase in environmental concern. Kids, I grew up in the 80s, so we were starting to learn about pollution and the hole in the ozone layer and all that stuff. So then we get to the 90s. This is probably the decade that most people remember as the last really active, engaged, and successful time in church, right? There were youth groups happening. There was a Christmas pageant every year with kids in it, and the church was filled at Easter and Christmas Eve at the very least. This is Gen X coming of age, right? Our disengagement, the rise of grunge and hip-hop music. Houses grew, and so did debt. This is a prominence of sort of the new age spirituality. Everyone's sort of like trying out their all different things. And we have sort of a bunch of big terrorism events. So we have the first bombing of the World Trade Centers. We have the Oklahoma City bombing. And then mass shootings start rising too, including the first big school shooting in Columbine. LGBTQ community starts becoming more acceptable. You see it more in popular media, although not fully, right? This is when Ellen DeGeneres lost her job when she came out. And you also have big prominent incidents of violence like Matthew Shepard. So then we get to 2000 to 2020. This one doesn't even break into a decade. It's really 2 decades that kind of stay about the same. We begin right off, 2001, with 9/11, which feels really recent to those of us who were adults at the time. But the kids becoming adults now are not even born at that point. We have sort of this, I saw one description of this, is called tacky prosperity. So it's like Paris Hilton and sort of McMansions and the giant SUVs and, just big and everything high cost. And then the fall of the big banks, the housing crisis and the recession. We have rapid advances in technology. I mean, if you think about where technology was in like 9/11 and sort of our little cell phones that we were trying to call people on and where we are now, or, just rapid. The dominance of social media. We have a climate crisis now. We've gone from just sort of recycle to now we're at a crisis point. We have a major shift in LGBTQ+ culture and rights, increasing conversations about race and other social justice issues, but also a rise in hate crimes. And we have increasing political, economic, religious, and social division. 2020 and beyond. Obviously, 2020 is going to be, and the early years after, it's all about the pandemic. But we have right-wing conservatism, we have a rise of Christian nationalism, there's a welcoming of different pronouns and gender diversity. The world and country, right now, I would imagine, is in many ways unrecognizable to a person who would have been living in the 50s, like an adult in the 50s. Now look at the church. How much of what we do now would seem very familiar to someone who came to church in 1952? Would your parents and grandparents even, back before then, apart from the way we record our sermon and maybe a better sound system, would they find this to be very much the same as what they experienced? And not just worship, but even how we organize things and our committee structure and all that stuff. Now, I'm not saying we should throw out everything and start anew. I mean, there are people who are doing that, and blessings on them. But there is something to be said about the continuity of some of what we do. Some traditions, some liturgy, and some rituals. There's something sometimes about doing something knowing that generation upon generation upon generation has done that same thing as well. But we need to acknowledge that sometimes we hold on so tight to those aspects that we miss opportunities for sharing our faith. We don't go to church anymore out of obligation, right? We don't have parents or grandparents or a church hierarchy. It's for you former Catholics, right? Telling you, here's your options, but you gotta pick one. Or even social norms telling us that we have to go. So why do we go to church? We find something here. And we're missing opportunities and I think methods to share that with the generations coming on behind us. And we're probably missing out on what God might be trying to do through us in these places because we're so focused on, but that's the way it's always been done. Can we be the balm? This is Jeremiah's question. Is there no balm in Gilead? Can we be that balm? Can the church somehow in this world, which most days seems irrevocably broken and full of pain and trouble, can we find a way to be a balm that will soothe the grief and trauma and pain that is being experienced outside these walls? Can we ask and then listen to what our neighbors in this community and nation and the wider world actually need and are seeking, to their hopes and dreams and fears, so that we might respond in kind, rather than simply trying to convince them to sit in a pew on Sunday morning? I hope so. I believe so. But it's going to take reflection, intention, and courage. Are you up for it?